In this unit, you're going to start to explore the environmental portrait. This is a really fun, creative, challenging, and really relevant area of portrait photography. You will see environmental portraiture everywhere in editorial photography, that is photography for magazines, newspapers, publications, print publications, but also including, of course, online publications. It's very, very common for the editor of a publication to have a photographer go out and make a photo of someone who's being profiled, a famous person who's being profiled in the newspaper, or a human interest story. It goes all the way from, well, very, very famous, powerful people into human interest stories at the very local level. And I will actually tell you that a few years ago, someone who took this portraiture class, their environmental portrait a few weeks later ended up on the pages of the local newspapers. So environmental portraiture has a very direct, practical application. Now, it's mostly for newspapers, mostly editorial, but there is also a growing interest by just from the retail customer, from someone who wants a really different kind of portrait, something that isn't just in a studio, something that feels more significant, especially maybe for their family, for a portrait for an engagement portrait. Environmental portraits are very, very relevant. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at some. I am going to start going back to the mid-20th century and really take a look at several photographs by the guy who we really think sort of started this whole environmental portraiture thing, Arnold Newman. And this first one is a portrait that he did of John F. Kennedy, I believe when JFK was still a senator. This is very early, he's quite young, and he's standing on the front of the Capitol. And so this is a classic environmental portrait. Now notice that even though the Capitol building is towering over him, he's very small in that right-hand corner, still, because of the way he's placed, because of the contrast, and because of that really intense expression and the light that's rimmed around him, he is the most important thing in the photograph. But it has him within this context of his emerging political power. Okay, so here's another Arnold Newman, and forgive me, I have been trying to figure out exactly who this man is. I know he's a writer, and this is just a brilliant environmental portrait. Now, it's nice if an environmental portrait can be authentic. That is, I think that's one of the sort of classics of environmental portraiture, is that you photograph the subject in their own place, or a place they really spend time in, something that's really truly relevant to them. And that's the case in this portrait. However, I suspect that Arnold Newman and his assistants may have had to do a little bit of work tweaking things around. So part of environmental portrait is not just finding a location and shoving your subject into it, but figuring out the best way to frame your subject within it. Arnold Newman was really brilliant at finding a really interesting location and moving the objects around in the background to create this perfect environment. Notice that as you go around the frame, it's all books. You don't have anything else distracting you, and it surrounds him. Now, I'm sure he had to actually push some books back and get this subject sort of wedged in there to make sure that he fit within this scene. And then, of course, it would be his responsibility, or his assistant's responsibility, to put everything back after they finish. Okay, the next one, also by Arnold Newman. This is of the painter Georgia O'Keeffe. This is an outdoor portrait. Now, I am going to ask you for your environmental portrait to do something that's not in all of the photographs that I'm going to show you in this presentation. I want you to add a strobe light of some kind to the scene, and we're going to learn how to do that. Now, I don't think Newman did that in this photograph, but I'll show you some later exterior photographs where it happened. Well, he took Georgia O'Keeffe, in this case, out to the outside in New Mexico, which was the place where she lived, the place that she loved the very most. It was her her chosen home. She was also very famous for making paintings of this landscape, for making paintings of skulls, and so all of that is incorporated. Again, Arnold Newman has a really interesting way of making sure that the subject, Georgia O'Keeffe in this case, is the most important, even though there's a lot going on around her. I really love this portrait. This is Alexander Calder, also by Arnold Newman. And you can see some of the same strategies that he used with the writer. Alexander Calder was a very famous artist, and he's photographing him in his studio. One of the great pleasures, I think, for environmental portraits, because artists are so wonderfully messy and have crazy stuff around. Now, this is, again, a really classic environmental portrait by Arnold Newman. He's got Alexander Calder right there in the middle, so that he's the focus of the scene, even though there's a lot going on. Now, one thing I want to point out here that we see in a lot of the Arnold Newman, but in other environmental portraits as well, is that oftentimes a slightly wide angle lens is acceptable for environmental portraiture, because what that does is it brings the figure, makes them slightly larger in relationship to the background. The background can compress, or not compress down, the background can sweep out to the back, and more of it will be included because the camera's getting a wider angle. So something to think about. This is Allen Ginsberg, the poet, in his New York apartment in the 60s, also by Arnold Newman. And my favorite Arnold Newman, this is Igor Stravinsky. This photograph, he very famously, he took Igor at the piano with the entire piano present, and then realized later that in order to make it really dramatic, he needed to crop the bottom part of the piano out. And again, that kind of classic Arnold Newman tucking the subject into the corner of the environment. Another Arnold Newman, forgive me, I don't remember the subject here. And let's move on now to Annie Leibovitz. So Annie Leibovitz still makes environmental portraits. I'm going to show you some of her later work, but it was really her early environmental portraits for Rolling Stone that made her quite famous. And they're very ingenious, very different from Arnold Newman. Really, one of the most famous photographs she ever made was this photograph of Yoko Ono and John Lennon in their apartment on their bed. There's not a lot of their environment, but the fact that they are in their bed, they're not in a studio, they're not against a white background, there's little bits and pieces of personal objects sort of tucking in from the corner. And of course, this very, very intimate moment. The other environmental portrait that I love, and I do consider this an environmental portrait, and notice that this is really playful. This is also by Annie Leibovitz, and this is Whoopi Goldberg in a bathtub full of milk. So this is staged. This is obviously not something that really happens in Whoopi Goldberg's life every day, but it adds this level of play and fun and comment about Whoopi Goldberg, about being a black star in the United States in a bathtub full of milk. Very funny, but also a little edgy. And yes, an environmental portrait. A little bit more formal, although the next one is even more formal yet. This was Annie Leibovitz's photograph of Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, of course, loves to be outdoors. She loves to be with her dogs. She's kind of a country woman, and so this is this beautiful but very, very well thought out portrait. Now, notice with these last few portraits, although it might not be obvious, there's almost certainly some added strobe lights coming in. And we're going to talk next unit about how that works, about how to bring in strobes. Sometimes you really, really see it. I'll show you some of those later on in this slide presentation. But sometimes it's less obvious. It's just filling in that space. This is also Queen Elizabeth. This, however, is by Thomas Struth. And this is a much, much, much more formal portrait of her. Environmental in her royal garb and in her royal surroundings. So really two very, very different views of Queen Elizabeth. Her sort of earnest, earthy true self, and also her true self, a different kind of true self as the queen. This is also Annie Leibovitz. This is Meryl Streep near her home. So this is a common theme in environmental portraiture, to place somebody outdoors in a place that they love. This one, I'm trying to remember who the subject is, but I love this. There's this offhand quality to this, but definitely, like, think about everything that we know about this guy just from this portrait. And it's all about the environment, the place he is, that we can see out the car, the dog, his position, his carrying a notebook, his 3-day beard. All of those things are part of the environment. They're part of the external areas, everything around him that tells us who he is. And so this is Bruce Springsteen. Obviously a very carefully staged environmental portrait with very specific objects, really beautifully composed. The space is broken up so nicely. And this is adding, both something we're familiar with maybe about Bruce Springsteen, and maybe layers that he is adding or incorporating, telling us another story about himself. So these portraits, the next environmental portraits I'm going to show you, are not of famous people. These are fine art portraits or documentary environmental portraits by Alex Soth, who really is interested in the vernacular, that is, photographing the people that he meets, the ordinary people. This is from a series that he did called Down the Mississippi, Along the Mississippi, where he photographed people that he met while moving up and down the Mississippi River. And this is another portrait by Alex Soth, an environmental portrait of a very, an ordinary, unknown person and her child. This photograph I've shown to a lot of classes. It has so much going on. The environment is actually very bleak. Some of the environment is in her dress. Some of the environment is in the way that she holds this child. But there's all of this information about her and about who she is and about what she might be struggling with in the environment. So these next portraits are by the American photographer Dawood Bey. He is a documentary photographer who does quite a lot of portraiture work, but also goes into the fine art territory. And his work is often about race and representation. So for this project, it was called the Birmingham Project. He made it in 2013. He traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, which was the site of a 1963 Baptist church bombing, in which 6 adolescent children died. And what he did was to go to significant areas in Birmingham. He photographed in 2 different locations, and he asked people from Birmingham to be part of these portraits. In each of these diptychs, one of the subjects is the age that one of those victims would have been at the time that they died in the fire, in the bombing, and the other is the age that same child would be had they lived until 2013. Sorry, that's a lot of explanation, but you can see that these are beautiful portraits, but they also carry this other layer of significance. So here's the first of these 2 diptychs that I'm going to show. There are about 16, I believe, in the whole series, so it's worth looking up and seeing them. But I wanted to show you just 2 of them in the 2 different locations. So Dawood Bey doesn't incorporate strobe into all of his work, but in this particular series, you can see that he has made a point of adding luminance to their faces from the front, which was very likely done with strobe lights. And if we go back, take a look at the first one, you can see that kind of illumination, and the same here. Now again, very subtle. We're going to take a look right now at some photos where that lighting is more obvious. So the next three photos are by a Native American photographer, Ryan Redcorn. He's from the Osage tribe, and he photographs members of the Osage tribe, really putting them into environments and, and having them wear clothing or carry objects that are significant to their experience as Native Americans. And so this one, of course, in this broad field in Oklahoma, wearing this young Native American is wearing a significant bolo tie. And what I want you to notice is how sort of striking that front light is. He very, very definitely took a strobe onto location and lit him up so he sort of glows within this cooler, darker background. And we're going to, like I said, next week we'll talk about how this is done. Let me show you a couple more by Ryan Redcorn. These are other members of the Osage tribe in here, carrying artifacts that are significant. I love this environment. Again, the town is stretched out in the background, so we have that environment. He's on a railing, and this actually quite hard and definite strobe light coming in from the other side to sort of pop him forward in the scene. And one more from Ryan Redcorn. Beautiful Native woman carrying a Native fan, and again, with that luminance, really almost surreally bringing her out of the environment. And so the last set of photos that I want to show in this part of this slide presentation are by a New York-based photographer, Aliyah Alba. And these are from a series of photos in a book she created called The Supper Club. This is a gathering. These are all people from a gathering of a diverse group of artists and writers in New York City who meet to talk about ideas of race and representation and art and creativity. And she has made a series of these really sort of extraordinary environmental portraits. They are on the edge of being surreal and imaginative. She uses kind of crazy light. This is a portrait of the artist Abigail DeVille. She's at the West Side Tavern, and notice she's got that really strong light up ahead. She's done some light painting behind, but allowed just a little bit of that actual tavern to come through. So this was photographed at the tavern. This isn't Photoshop. This is an environmental portrait, but a very imaginative kind of over-the-top environmental portrait. We'll take a look at a few more. This is clearly very staged. This is Alejandra Guzman in 2015. She's given them all these sort of magical titles as well, almost as if they are tarot cards. So again, this is an artist, and they've gone through and really sort of restaged his studio, given him a little bit of colored light on his face. So again, these are environmental portraits. They are truthful to the subject, but they're jumping over into a fantasy land. And the final one that I want to show you is The Reader. Now, I've posted links to the websites of many of these artists, especially the more contemporary ones. I really encourage you to go take a look, read some articles, and explore these artists a little further. I hope they are inspiring to you. And in the next presentation, I'm going to show you some examples of student work from this assignment from past classes.